Shooting handheld. Now, I'm someone that just recently leaned into shooting handheld within the past year, specifically with my Sony a7S III, which has the active steady shot stabilization system built in, which is, at this point, I would say Sony's best foray into the IBIS realm. The reality is, though, IBIS is just a tiny component of being able to shoot handheld in a DSLR or mirrorless camera. You ultimately want to be able to do a bunch of different things with your body and with the camera and camera system you're working in that are going to help get smooth, steady shots out of handheld action. Now, handheld, of course, can look very raw and real, right? Sometimes you want a little more shake and things, but sometimes you also want to be able to get kind of smooth, almost slider or parallax type emulation shots. So if you're shooting handheld, what are some of the ways you can get just good, solid handheld shots with your DSLR mirrorless camera? Without further ado, 8 tips that I've come up with and that I've been utilizing and leaning into heavily over the past year or so that have enabled me to do this. And probably some of which you haven't heard or haven't been mentioned quite in this way up to this point. So tip number 1, boat sway. And you're probably thinking, what? Let me explain. So imagine you're on a boat in some body of water, just kind of naturally rocking back and forth, left to right. Certainly not enough to make you seasick or anything, but just enough to have some natural movement that feels, well, maybe like you're on water to an extent. That's boat sway. In reality, this is going to be something that not only enables you to shoot for a prolonged period of time handheld, rather than trying to stay perfectly still and eventually watching that shot get shaky over time as you fatigue, but also having a very kind of natural left to right movement that will give the footage a very nice look and actually enable you to motivate movement into other parts of your shot. Now, tip number 2, hips. Yes, it is true that it is all in the hips in terms of how you get movement, assuming we're not actually trying to truly move and walk with the camera. Now, being able to just take your hips and kind of jet them out to one side and slowly roll that over to the other side is something that's going to enable you to get a lot of good shots. And again, something where you can get a sort of slider-like shot, something where you can move around an object slightly, all without moving your body in the process. You stay stationary, but your hips do some of the movement and work. Tip number 3, points of contact. Now, in this case, you have to keep in mind where and how you're holding the camera and just utilize that to your best advantage. Now, in my case, I will take my right hand and place that on the grip of the camera, seated firmly, and then take my left hand and use that around the barrel of the lens. Now, this left hand on the lens actually accomplishes a couple purposes. Of course, I'm using that point of contact to help stabilize the body of the camera, but I'm also, in the case of a zoom lens, able to extend or detract the zoom and kind of control that all at once while I'm doing it. Now, of course, in terms of points of contact, I haven't really talked about the case if you have a top handle, but we're going to touch on top handles later. But for one other point that relates to your body and how that would work, let's get into tip 4. So tip number 4, lock your arms. Now, in this case, I'm actually a musician part-time, and much like with drummers, as they'll say, where it's all in your wrists in terms of how you play, I think it's very similarly true of camera operation as well. Rather than necessarily kind of aimlessly flailing your arms to move the camera and get shots, you want to actually lock your arms, not so that they're too rigid, but so that they're mostly in place, and again, the hips, the boat sway, and some of these other techniques we talked about are doing the movement for you. So now that we've covered the elements of your body, there's also considering the camera you're using and how that comes into play. So 4 tips that are going to relate to that. So tip number 5, weight. Basically, up to a certain threshold, the more weight you're able to add to your camera, the more this will aid in being able to get a steady, solid handheld shot. And this could come in a few different ways, right? Whether you're adding a cage or other sort of system to your camera, if you're shooting with a larger and heavier lens, this is certainly one way to accomplish it. It is more than likely true that the lighter your camera is, the more chance you might have for different micro jitters and other things you'll have to compensate for. Now, in my case, one of my preferred handheld setups is to actually use my 24-70 f2.8 G Master lens with my Sony a7S III. That lens, not just for its focal length and the versatility of that, it also happens to be a much heavier lens compared to, say, some of my other prime lenses, but isn't necessarily unreasonably heavy like, say, my 70-200 G Master lens, which would be a cumbersome type of experience trying to shoot handheld with. Now, tip number 6, IBIS. Now, IBIS, or in-body image stabilization, as I did touch on during the intro of this, basically is going to allow your camera to take out some of those handheld shakes and micro jitters that you might want to eliminate when you're trying to shoot handheld. But IBIS in and of itself can be a mixed bag. Number one, certainly with things like cinema cameras and other cameras that have built-in ND filters, you often will not find IBIS present on that camera. Now, of course, if your camera has an IBIS system, like many of Sony's previous models, with just a plain steady shot standard system, this works okay in getting out some of the smallest movements and jitters from a shot, but isn't very aggressive in terms of removing other types of shake. Now, Sony's steady shot active stabilization system does work a bit better and help with this, but ultimately you'll just have to test this and see what works best for you and your camera, really. Now, tip number 7, top handle. Seems like we've been dodging this one for a bit, but in reality, a top handle is going to be a huge component of being able to shoot handheld. I will still use my right hand on the grip of the camera a lot of times, but more often than not, I will also use the top handle to help get a good stable shot. The top handle is going to essentially let more of gravity than your hands necessarily doing the work for you and keeping your camera steady, and is really something that's going to allow you to shoot handheld for a long period of time, or especially if and as you try to do more dramatic movements with handheld shots. Now, many camera cases, whether say from Small Rig or Tilta or Condor Blue, are going to have some option to integrate a top handle into it, and I think these will all work pretty well. However, you might also want a versatile top handle option that could work with, say, your hot or cold shoe that you can just adapt on your camera when you need it, and for that, I do actually have a recommendation, which in this case would be tip number 8, my recommendation on top handles. So Small Rig makes a 2094 top handle that I've really come to enjoy and have been using a lot with my A7S III now, and I've even used on my A7 III when I've wanted to occasionally try shooting handheld with that. Now, Small Rig does make, I think, a few different versions of this handle. I know I have the 2094B model, which has been really nice, and I think they just released or are releasing a 2094C. I imagine this is just as nice as the B model and probably has some improvements over that, but ultimately I've been really happy with this. And so those are my 8 tips for shooting handheld with your DSLR or mirrorless camera. Now, hopefully this video has been of some help to you. Feel free to leave a like and subscribe if it has. I'm definitely going to be doing more content around shooting styles and, well, a lot of other camera and videography related things if you've checked out my channel otherwise up to this point. That is all I have to say. So thanks for watching.